Well, howdy everybody, and welcome back to the farm. Welcome to Volume 4 of The Bronze Age Collapse. Today we're going to be talking mostly about Moses. There's going to be a lot about Moses today. We're going to be digging into his ethnicity, what's going on there, his motivations, how politically motivated was he versus spiritually motivated? Was there a development, a change, or a progression? We'll look into that. We're going to be looking closely at the Exodus account from the Pentateuch, the second book of the Old Testament, the one after Genesis. We're going to talk about what Exodus means, why they named it that. Why does this book have a Greek name? Exodos is not a Hebrew word. It's very Greek. And of course, if we're talking about the Exodus and Moses and the Sinai Peninsula, that means we're going to be talking about Iceland, which makes perfect sense. Anytime you're talking about Eastern Egypt in the Bronze Age, and rebels and religious zealots, you have to talk about volcanoes. But as we'll see, this random event from thousands and thousands of miles away had a huge effect, I think, on the events that we're going to be discussing. We'll also talk about another person that becomes very important early on in the Exodus account, and that's this guy, Aharon, pronounced today in English as Aaron, Aaron. So that Key and Peele sketch where the substitute teacher keeps pronouncing Aaron as Aaron is kinda right. Maybe he was trained in classical Hebrew, but in any case, Aaron was originally, as far as we can tell, Aharon. And there's also mystery about his name. But as we'll see, Aaron was supposed to be much more in tune with and trained in the Abrahamic tradition that the proto-Israelites were following in Goshen. And we've talked about whether or not Moses is a real person. But the interesting thing about his brother, Aaron, is that we have literal DNA evidence that he existed, which is kind of cool, and we'll talk a lot more about that. And so, the first thing we need to do, I think, is just talk about the broad strokes of the Exodus story. What happens? Well, Exodus is really divided in two. It's a kind of neat literary structure because the first half, leading up to the encounter with Yahweh on Mount Sinai. Not the burning bush, mind you. That occurs very early on in the Exodus story. But the central climax of the story is Moses climbing Mount Sinai to receive the Decalogue, which is an old Greek word for the Ten Commandments. And once again, later on we'll talk about why is everything in Greek? You might be thinking, well, dude, you just said in the last episodes that ancient Greek didn't even really exist yet in the form that we recognize. So why is all this stuff from the 1100s BC being given Greek names? Well, we'll talk about that. But back to the outline of the Exodus story. The Exodus story starts with the Pharaoh, and we'll talk about which Pharaoh are they probably talking about. The Pharaoh had become very concerned about how many Israelites were living in Egypt and how strong they still were, despite their lower status. And the Pharaoh reduced them even further to a de facto slave status. And the Pharaoh's concern continues and gets to the point where he orders the midwives of the Hebrews to allow the female children to live, but to kill the male Israelite children. Now, Exodus tells us that these midwives do not obey the Pharaoh's orders, and there are consequences for that. But even though the male children are not being killed, there's one Levite woman who is with child, and she gives birth to a son, apparently by herself. And to save the child's life, she swaddles it up and places it in a basket and floats it upstream on one of the branches of the Nile to head toward one of the city centers, maybe even Pyramessa, although the Exodus story does specify the Nile. But once again, as I'll do continually, I'll remind everyone that all these details were passed down orally for hundreds of years before they were written down. And so recalling exactly what waterway the basket was placed on might be unreasonable for us to demand. Now, according to the Exodus story, none other than the daughter of the Pharaoh adopts him and gives him the Egyptian name Moses. And we'll talk about why I doubt the details of this, but the spirit of the story, the general idea that's being conveyed, I think is true. In previous volumes, we talked about Moses' name and his possible ethnicity. And although Moses clearly has an Egyptian identity, very early on, the Exodus story makes it clear that Moses has very close sympathies and some sort of tie to the Israelites. As we discussed in the previous volume, early on in Exodus, Moses kills an Egyptian that he sees beating an Israelite like a slave, indicating how low the status of the Israelites had become. And so when Moses finds out that the Egyptian authorities might be coming for him, he flees Egypt and passes through Goshen to take refuge in Midian, which is in the northwestern portion of the Arabian Peninsula. So basically, Moses is wanted for murder, most likely has been branded a violent radical or rebel, and he passes through Goshen, where he no doubt receives help from relatives. But then, once in Goshen, apparently, he keeps going, and he goes all the way through the Sinai Peninsula into what's now Saudi Arabia. So it's actually on the Arabian Peninsula where Moses meets the burning bush. He doesn't meet the burning bush in Egypt, or even in Sinai, where he had his second encounter with Yahweh. While Moses is on the lam, hiding out in Midian, he takes on work as a shepherd, and while he is alone in the wilderness with his flock, he encounters the burning bush. Moses also marries a woman named Zipporah, who is the daughter of a priest in Midian. And we're not told exactly what this priest does or what they believe. I think it's safe to assume that this Jethro person was not practicing one of the abhorrent or otherwise weird and terrible religions practiced in Canaan or even in Egypt. I think it's safe to assume that this priesthood was somehow associated with the Israelites, or was at least some sort of monotheistic belief system also. I think it's safe to say that Jethro most likely did not worship the Canaanite god Baal or Bel. For the purposes of this podcast, I'm going to go with Baal. I know that's not the standard pronunciation, but I feel silly saying Baal and people worshiping Baal. And that's going to come up a lot later. So it's safe to say that Jethro was not a priest of Baal. He was not performing human sacrifices out in this scraggly, sparsely populated wilderness of Midian. So the picture that Exodus is painting is of a changed man, someone whose heart has shifted. It looks like now he's a family man. He has met the burning bush, and he has changed. He's not who he was back in Pyramessa. And then Moses receives news that the Pharaoh has died, and a new Pharaoh has ascended to the throne. And we'll talk about which Pharaoh was this, and did it happen at exactly this time? But anyway, in the Exodus story, Moses returns to Egypt to talk to this new Pharaoh. Moses also reconnects with his brother Aaron, and they go to Egypt to start their mission. I'm going to go ahead and say, we're not going to get to the plagues of Egypt or the Passover story until a later volume, but as usual, I think it's important to focus on the structure or the groundwork, the foundations of the story. And so, when did all this happen? And does this fit into what historians and archaeologists have figured out? Well, let's first talk about this Pharaoh dying, because, according to this, Moses' return to Egypt and his activities there, and the marching out of Egypt east into the wilderness, took place sometime around the death of some pharaoh. Well, as I've talked about endlessly in previous volumes, I think that the primary pharaoh that Moses dealt with was Ramses III. But the problem is that Ramses III died in 1155 BC, but I think that's a little too late, just by a few years. And I'm suggesting that getting the death of a pharaoh wrong by about 5 years or less, when you're trying to piece the story together from oral traditions that are hundreds of years old, I think in that case, being only a few years off is pretty darn good. I don't think this is referring to the death of our old friend Ozymandias. Ramses II, aka Ozymandias, died in 1186, but I think that's way too early. That's almost a decade before the fall of Troy, and very close to a decade before Ramses III defeats the Sea Peoples. And I'm arguing that the Exodus is the result of unrest among the next generation of the Sea Peoples, combined with unrest of people who had been living in Egypt for hundreds of years, or since the founding, who were also up in arms. Because due to the economic disasters and the ecological disasters that were occurring, the Pharaoh was reducing more and more people to a slave status. So I'm going to argue that all of Moses' life occurred after Ozymandias died. I'm claiming that Moses was born right around the time that Ramses II died and Ramses III took over. So I'm going to claim that Moses was born in or around Pyramessa around 1180 BC, shortly after the death of Ramses II, and just before the fall of Troy in 1179. So according to my theory, Moses could have been born on the same night that the Trojans dragged the Trojan horse through their gates and into their city, on that same night that it fell. That may have been right around the same time that Levite Israelite woman who gave birth to that child under circumstances that are not elaborated on, and we'll talk about why that might be, she placed that baby in the basket and sent it down the river right around the same time that Odysseus and his pals laid waste to the grand metropolis of Troy. So Moses is definitely a product of the Bronze Age collapse. I'm going to argue that he might be the most emblematic figure of this period. And not because he's so famous, or the only famous person from that period. I'm going to argue that the circumstances of his birth, the questions about his ethnicity and loyalty, his religious transformation, and his leadership over this ragtag group of people on their way to Canaan, and how it seems that Moses and his brother Aaron really did create a new ethnicity, the ethnicity of later people that would be called Jews, like David or Solomon. But those people are generations away. And so that's why I think it's important to study Moses, and why he keeps coming up during a discussion of the Bronze Age collapse. And so now let's go back to this angry young man we met at the end of the last volume. An angry young man with strong political and religious ideas. When did Moses slay this Egyptian who was beating an Israelite? So according to my theory, Moses was in his physical prime in 1160 BC. And what do I mean by physical prime? I'm assuming late teens, early 20s, because people got an early start back then. So let's assume that in 1160, Moses became active in whatever violent rebel group he had joined. And I say joined because he doesn't seem to be any kind of leader at the beginning of the story. In Exodus, we meet Moses as a young Egyptian who has extreme sympathies with the Israelites, so much so that he has gained the skill and the determination to kill a man with a knife. And so it seems that Moses fled Egypt shortly after this event. So that would mean that Moses fled to Midian around 1160 BC, after he finds out that the word on the street is that he's a killer, and Egyptian agents might be coming after him. So he runs off to this place called Midian, a fairly barren place in the northwest corner of the Arabian Peninsula. And boy, did these eastern mountains in Midian and in Sinai have a huge effect on young Moses. And also, I'm claiming that at the same time that Moses was in Midian, a geologic event occurred that changed the whole world. And by the way, I find it interesting that when Moses fled Egypt, what did he do? Like I said in previous volumes, when the going got tough in the Bronze Age, people would just pull up roots and leave, and go back to a nomadic or semi-nomadic existence in the wilderness, like their ancestors had been doing for thousands of years before these city centers and their intensified agriculture came along. And this also, I think, reveals that Moses wasn't really exactly a noble. And also Moses had some sort of connection with these people. Exodus does tell us that Moses had a brother among the Israelites east of where Moses started out. And so I'm claiming that Moses knew somebody in Midian, or somebody was a distant relative, because back then, when you're in trouble, when you're on the run, you'll tend to go somewhere where you know someone, where you have relatives, or at the very least, a place where people speak a language that you can speak. Remember that the punishment of exile was considered almost as bad as the death penalty because the wilderness was so dangerous for exiles and wanderers, people like Moses. So other than Moses getting a job as a shepherd, and perhaps this volcanic eruption in Iceland, what else happened while Moses was in Midian? Well, let's start with the second most famous event. That's his marriage to the daughter of a priest who lived in Midian. The priest's name was Jethro, and his daughter's name was Zipporah. And there's actually a meet cute in the Bible here, where Moses meets his future wife. And what had happened was, Moses was doing his shepherd work, and he came to a well, and these two women were at the well, drawing water for their flocks. And these were two of Jethro's 6 daughters. So once again, this guy kept busy, and no doubt kept his wife, Reuel, also very, very busy. And Moses sees these women at the well, but then he sees some other shepherds, other locals with their own flocks that they need to water, and they show up and they start bullying the women, trying to make them leave the well. And Moses, once again, intervenes. He's kind of a superhero like that. He slew the Egyptian who was beating up the Israelite, and now he's saving these 2 women from these bullies. And Moses intervenes and forces them to leave and leave the women alone. They're lucky Moses didn't slay them like he did that Egyptian back home. And then, shortly after that, Moses and Zipporah fell in love. Maybe. Maybe not. That didn't matter as much in the Bronze Age. And so Moses was married. And he had tied himself to this family in Midian, and in particular, this guy Jethro, the priest. Now on to the most famous incident that happened to Moses in Midian, and that's his encounter with the burning bush. I'm suggesting that Moses encountered the burning bush in the same year that the Hekla volcano erupted in Iceland, and that would be about 1159 or 1158 BC. And what do you know? 1158 is exactly when the labor strikes arose in Egypt. And I'm claiming that the labor strike is just one very conspicuous symptom of the economic and political problems that Egypt was experiencing. In particular, their dear leader, Lil Ramses. He was trying to keep everything together, but it wasn't working out very well because this volcano, as I said in the last volume, blotted out the sun for about 7 years. And so 1159 would have been the first year without food, without a crop. And people started to get very anxious and angry and violent. So what do I think is going on in Egypt while Moses is in Midian? And what set the conditions for his return? Exodus tells us that at some point Moses finds out that the other Pharaoh had died and that conditions in Egypt had changed and that he could return. Now, I've already suggested that the death of the Pharaoh that people are talking about here would be the death of Ramses III, really the assassination of Ramses III, in 1155. I'm saying that this is 4 to 5 years after Moses returns, because I think Ramses III, aka Lil Ramses, was actually the pharaoh that had to deal with Moses and his movement. So let's turn away from Exodus for a minute and look at some of our other sources for what may have been going on in Egypt during this time. And we find out about this incident called the labor strikes at Deir el-Medina in what is now modern Egypt. This occurred in 1158 BC. I'm suggesting that this is shortly after the eruption of the Hekla volcano in Iceland. So I'm suggesting that there is some connection between the failed crops and the unrest in the other parts of Egypt. This contributed to the economic and political problems that ensued. Now, Deir el-Medina is the modern name of the place where this occurred, and it occurred far, far south of Pyramessa, and farther south than even the site of modern Cairo. It's way south, halfway to Sudan. It was a place that was called the Place of Truth. And what do you know? It was a settlement of laborers outside of Luxor. And these were not slave laborers. These were well-compensated and highly regarded artisans that worked directly for the pharaoh. And they built tombs, grave goods, and a lot of the monuments and artifacts that we still study today. And so they were segregated from the rest of Egypt. And it is said that this is because these artisans knew royal secrets. They knew where the burial chambers were. They knew what was put into them. And so they were regarded almost as keepers of state secrets. And so they really thought highly of themselves, because when the flood of gold and luxury goods stopped after the eruption and the uprisings farther north in Egypt, these artisans way down south got really annoyed with the pharaoh, who was spending all his time in Pyramessa trying to deal with all these foreigners and uprisings in the north. They felt a little bit neglected. They felt taken for granted, apparently, and they went on strike. And so I'm claiming that if conditions worsened to that extent for these people, for the people in the place of truth, then that tells me that conditions were far worse for other classes of laborers. And I think most of you would agree with me when I assume that this means that people that were in the slave class, people who were on the opposite end of the social spectrum from these high-class artisans, I suspect that these slave status people weren't getting any food at all. If resources are so scarce that Lil Ramses is having trouble paying his army and his chief artisans, then we know that there's a problem, and there's a very, very little chance that the descendants of the Sea Peoples or the Israelites to the east are receiving any sort of assistance from the Egyptian government. So Egypt turned into a mess. It fell apart. And so now, before we turn back to Exodus, let's think about what is the consensus of historians on what happened during the Exodus? Do they think it happened in the way it happens in Exodus? How inaccurate or exaggerated do they think it is? The consensus of modern scholars about the historicity of the Exodus story that is presented in the Pentateuch, well, modern scholars generally say that Exodus does not give an accurate account of the origins of the Israelites, And in fact, the Israelites appear to have emerged in the central highlands of Canaan in the late 2nd millennium BC. Well, what do you know? That is the time of the Bronze Age collapse. But scholars are saying that there is no Egyptian connection. Well, that's kind of weird. Why were they saying that they were led out of Egypt? And why would they say they were led out of Egypt by someone with an Egyptian name? And of course, no one is really claiming to be Egyptian. The Israelites said they moved into eastern Egypt from Canaan, and they maintained the cultural practices that they had back there. They didn't become Egyptian. And then when things got real bad in Egypt, they managed to escape their slave status and returned to Canaan. As I've said before, the Promised Land was really a memory of the beautiful place that their ancestors lived in before the famine forced the descendants of Jacob to leave Canaan for Egypt under the protection of Joseph. So what I'm suggesting is that this group of people, combined with some group of radicalized Egyptians and even portions of the population of the descendants of the Sea Peoples who were captured, all banded together along with a huge group of people from Goshen to travel east under Moses' protection and Aaron's leadership. And that was a tough road. And I think scholars are not being charitable or very imaginative because they're thinking that the Israelites are claiming that they're all descended from this group that came out of Egypt. And there's something like over 500,000 people that crossed Sinai and walked into Canaan. Well, I'm suggesting something very different. I think that the group that left Egypt under the leadership of Moses and Aaron was actually fairly small. I'm thinking more like 10,000 people rather than hundreds of thousands of people. A city-sized mob of people is just not going to last long in the wastelands of Sinai. But 10,000 hardened people with practical skills, skilled shepherds and keepers of livestock, skilled soldiers, slingers, fishermen, hunters. A small group of these people could very believably survive that trip. And we know from the Exodus story that it wasn't easy, and there were very tense moments where this group almost fractured, and the leadership of the Israelite contingent that followed this one particular Canaanite god, their leadership was brought into question multiple times. So, if 500,000 people wandered through Sinai for 30 years before they ended up in Canaan, there probably would be some sort of archaeological record of that. Or at least we would expect to maybe find one someday. And then we would be able to show a major difference between what would later become the Jewish population and the other Canaanites. We would be able to find some sort of big genetic difference between the people now called Jews and the other Canaanites. But it looks like the Israelites are essentially Canaanites. Now, scholars think that's because the Israelites emerged in Canaan, but I think that, sure, this emergence of the Israelites in Canaan radiated from the survivors of this group that made it back to Canaan. And so archaeologists are not going to find the evidence for this incident. And so, given the account that the Israelites present themselves about their origin, I think that carries quite a bit of weight. especially when it doesn't disagree with the physical evidence that we have, and it fits in nicely with a lot of the records that the Egyptians left behind. And they certainly weren't trying to propagandize people to follow the Ten Commandments and believe in Yahweh. So the scholars are right in the sense that a lot of Israelite culture was very similar to Canaanite culture. So the Israelites were Canaanites, but they had unusual religious beliefs that clearly set them apart. But they were ethnically Canaanite, essentially. These descendants of Jacob that left for Egypt had been there for hundreds of years. And I would presume that they were not just strictly intermarrying among themselves. It was way too small of a group. So I think we can safely assume that inevitably, while a lot of the women were strictly being married to sons and grandsons and great-grandsons of Abraham, because the father of the household would determine what religion the children were raised in, so we would not want these Abrahamic women marrying pagan Canaanite men and raising their children to believe in human sacrifice and worshiping golden bulls and that sort of thing. There were Abrahamic men who married Canaanite women who would, of course, convert. Now, I wonder if this is the reason for the later regulation in Judaism that your mother has to be Jewish or else you have to convert. That rule was not always there, especially when we're limited to literally one family or one small tribe of people. Ancient people generally did avoid incest or marriages between people who were too closely related. This whole brother-sister thing was pretty much just an Egyptian thing, and most people even avoided first cousins. Now, in most communities back then, second and third cousins were fair game. Not a problem. We're talking about some very small communities here. So just like there are Catholic Germans and Protestant Germans and atheist Germans, but they're all Germans, then there were also Canaanite communities that worshipped Baal or Baal or Bel with human sacrifices. They intermarried with West Asian nomads, similar to the Trojans. Then there were Canaanite communities that were heavily Hellenized, i.e., Greekified. They couldn't even say the sh sound anymore. And then you have groups of Canaanites that worshipped El, which just means God, although there were different personalities for El, demonstrating that this is a generic word for God that people had differing beliefs about. And so the voice that Abraham heard outside of Ur so long before then was called God, or El, even though this El had very different characteristics from the typical El of the indigenous Canaanite population. And so this Abrahamic group of Canaanites had roots in Mesopotamia, not Greece or West Asia. And that's the group that we're focusing on. This tribe that called themselves the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so when this community moved into eastern Egypt around 1600 BC, they, of course, started to become more and more culturally distinct from their former Canaanite neighbors over the next 400 years, as you do, and their monotheistic practices continued to evolve in near isolation in Goshen. So wait a minute, Vincent, are you suggesting that the prehistoric Israelites called themselves one particular ethnicity, even though they were a ragtag group of Canaanites mixed with some other sea peoples and Egyptian rebels that tagged along on this trip back to the promised land of their ancestors? Well, yeah. You had a lot of ethnicities that were forming during this time, and they were made of other groups, kind of just glued together, like the scraps of chicken that are glued together to make a chicken nugget. And you can make that nugget shaped like a chicken part all you want. Everybody knows it's made of pieces of 12 different chickens. And so I'm claiming that the Israelites were a composite of previous groups. I'm claiming that the Greeks are a composite of earlier groups. I'm claiming that the Romans were a composite of earlier groups. So the Israelites were not alone at all. This is just what happened during the Bronze Age collapse. And even before the Bronze Age collapse, it's clear that the ethnic groups that we find, if we look closely enough, we'll find that they're a mixture of older groups of Mediterranean people, along with some intermingling of ethnic groups on the fringes. And I think this happened because when you have an entire section of the world that has almost exclusively brown skin, brown hair, brown eyes, then it can be difficult to tell ethnic groups apart, aside from language and religion. And so you can see evidence of this mixture, this combination of older ethnicities into new ones, especially when you look at groups where, sure, most people had brown skin, but then you've got some pale skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair, and then in other places you have very dark skin and sub-Saharan African features. And the larger and more urban the ethnic group, and the more scattered it was, the more you find these exceptions. For example, Egyptian definitely wasn't a pure ethnicity. They were mostly genetically related to Mesopotamians who had settled there. But of course, there was an admixture of indigenous African genetics. But still, Ramses II, aka Ozymandias, as we've talked about, had pale skin and naturally red hair. So, when I talk about someone who's quote-unquote ethnically Egyptian, as I've described Moses, it's not some kind of magic genetic sequence. There's no Egyptian gene. There's not even some sort of facial characteristic or type of hair that marks you as Egyptian. It was a big, crowded, diverse place. But there was definitely an Egyptian cultural identity. And so you could tell who was loyal to the pharaoh and who was not. Who was a quote-unquote real Egyptian and who was not. And so these foreigners were not assimilated. They lived in their own communities. They had their own languages and religions. When the food runs out, when the army is a shadow of its former self, well, now you've got a big problem. Because these people have been under the thumb of the pharaoh for, in some cases, a generation, and then in some cases, hundreds of years. So there's quite a bit of resentment that had built up, right up to the point of this volcanic eruption, which made everything far, far worse. And I think that these disruptions in Egypt and word that the pharaoh had failed to retaliate against certain actions, basically, the news that Egypt was now paralyzed and falling apart, that was what called Moses back. that's how he knew that it was time to act with his new priorities and under the leadership of this God, Yahweh. And so Moses returns to Egypt, presumably leaving his wife Zipporah behind for safety. And he goes back to meet up with his brother Aaron. And so I'm saying that Moses was the nom de guerre of an Egyptian rebel leader after his experiences in Midian, and after becoming a family man, his priorities changed. And this is when he seems to have taken on the identity of a humble shepherd. And in all of the iconography, Moses is represented now as having the wise gray hair, the big beard, the brown robes, and of course, the shepherd's crook, the giant walking stick with the hook at the end. And here, with Moses, it's a symbol of his leadership over his flock. In other words, the people that he led out of Egypt and into Sinai. Now let's take a minute to talk about Moses' ethnicity again. If we're looking at Exodus, Exodus clearly states that Moses was actually an Israelite by birth, as in born to two Israelite parents, but raised in an Egyptian noble family. Exodus also states that Moses was the biological brother of an Israelite named Aaron, Aharon. So, Exodus is telling us something. There was an issue with Moses' birth or ancestry. His ancestry is either mixed or uncertain or both. It's pretty clear that he has some relation to the Israelites, despite his Egyptian name and his apparent urban Egyptian culture. He still has this brother to the east who was raised in the Israelite tradition. So what's that about? Why the difference between Moses and Aaron? Well, how about this? What if... Well, before I go into my theory, let's talk a little bit more about the basket story. We mentioned earlier that the current pharaoh, I'm saying it's Lil Ramses, was very, very concerned about these teeming slave settlements where there were a growing number of angry, hungry young people. And again, he was trying to do some sort of compromise to avoid open war, just like he did with all the settlements in the first place. And so Exodus is saying that during the time of Moses' birth, Ramses III secretly orders Israelite midwives to kill the male children and allow female Israelite children to live. And this order may have actually happened. You never know. Rulers in antiquity had some strange ideas, some cruel plans, but this just doesn't seem to be a practical solution. But I think there's some truth to the story. It's clear that the Egyptian government was becoming very concerned about all these bitter, disloyal people living on the outskirts of Egypt. And so this Levite woman avoids the midwives, and she gives birth to her son, and she places the child in a basket and sends it up the river. Really, it would have to be downstream, but looking at the geography, it's a little hard to trace where this basket would have gone. In the Nile Delta, waterways come and go over time. And Exodus implies that Moses was raised as part of an Egyptian noble family. The daughter of the pharaoh himself supposedly found the basket. Now, once again, I think there's some truth to this. This account is reflecting a troubled or problematic birth. Why did this Levite woman avoid the midwives? There's no mention of her husband. I think you know what I'm getting at here. I wonder if Moses was Israelite through his mother, but then Egyptian through his father. And he was the half-brother of Aaron, not a full brother. The cultural difference between Moses and Aaron could be explained by Moses being trained in Egyptian culture and religion as a child under his Egyptian father in a comfortable urban setting. And then Aaron was raised by an Israelite father who taught him the practices and beliefs of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so we have two men that share a genetic legacy, but they are from two different worlds. And that is the picture that we get in Exodus. You have these two men who are quote-unquote brothers, and while the Pentateuch describes Aaron as a priest of Israel, I don't know about this idea that Moses was part of the nobility. I think that in antiquity, the term brother was used pretty loosely, and then the idea of someone being in the nobility was kind of seen as a binary thing. You were either in or you were out. And Moses apparently had some connections to upper-class Egyptians. But a noble Egyptian would be very literate, trained to be a leader over the peasantry, and you wouldn't learn how to hide bodies because you wouldn't need to hide bodies of people you killed. And if you had to flee, you'd be more likely to find work copying books or even hunting. Hunting was a major pastime for Egyptian nobles. I mean, you're in Africa, after all, and the Sahara was much smaller, and overall, the Mediterranean was much less desertified. So animals that are now primarily sub-Saharan, at this time, had habitats that were much farther north. So I think the baby in the basket story is a reflection of Moses being born out of wedlock, maybe with uncertain paternity, maybe even growing up an orphan who had to do some sort of work. There are a lot of possibilities here, but the overall effect on Moses is the same. Moses is a man torn between two worlds. There's a bit of the Joker in him. If the Joker had started off as a terrorist, but then had a mystical experience that transformed him. And here is a bloated, bustling city full of blood, money, and corruption. And then there's this man of uncertain identity, a man with no real allegiances, a man who is sick at heart at the treatment of the foreigners that he's partly related to. And he decides to take action. He wants justice. Now, after the burning bush experience, and after Moses is told that things have changed back in Egypt, he decides to reconnect with Aaron and then go on to Paramessa to confront the Pharaoh. This is kind of a big deal. This is a bold claim. These multiple audiences that Aaron and Moses have with Ramses III. And I'm skipping over some details about the burning bush. We're going to talk about that in the next volume of the Bronze Age collapse, when we try to investigate the origins of Yahweh. Where did Yahweh first come from? Or you could say, when and where did Yahweh first reveal himself with that name? It's very, very unlikely that Abraham knew about this Yahweh word or name. And I find it super fascinating. unfortunately for you guys, so we'll be talking about that a lot later on. And speaking of names and what they mean, let's talk a little bit about Greek. Sorry, guys.
We're going down to ancient Greek grammar junction, where every word has a specific function. It ain't fun, it ain't sexy, it's not even all that interesting. But for some reason, Vincent is obsessed. So let's hear him out.
Okay, so the book is called Exodus. That's the Latin pronunciation and spelling of a Greek word, exodos. Now, I think we're all familiar with the Greek prefix ex, which means out of, and hodos. Hodos in Greek means a path or a way. It's a lot like via in Latin or dao in Chinese. So, exodos is just a Greek word for the way out, the path that takes you away, the road leading out. And so, what's with all this Greek? Well, it all goes back to a text that scholars of ancient history call the Septuagint. The Septuagint. 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 That's just a short form of the Latin word Septuaginta, which means 70. And it refers to a Greek version of the Old Testament that was written down in the middle 3rd century BC, during what we call the Hellenistic period. The few hundred years right after Alexander, where the Eastern Mediterranean had a kind of renaissance. It was a very busy time in terms of culture and architecture and trade. So it's a positive time. And of course, Alexander was the person who founded Alexandria on the very northern coast of Egypt. It was a port city, but it was also a center of economic activity and cultural activity. And if you want to know how different things had become in the last almost 1,000 years since Lil Ramses, the pharaoh who commissioned this translation of the Old Testament was named Ptolemaios II. And as you might detect, Ptolemaios is a Greek name because, after Alexander, all of the pharaohs were of Macedonian origin. So, Cleopatra means flesh of her father in Macedonian Greek. She was 100% Macedonian. And that is an indication of how weak Egypt had become in the classical period. I sometimes describe it as France. In France's earlier history, it was a military power, and it projected power across the world. But later in France's history, it became known for military weakness, and it sort of just relied on its ancientness, its cultural legacy. And Egypt did have a very considerable cultural legacy. And by the Hellenistic period, almost 1,000 years after Moses, there were more Jews living in Alexandria than in Jerusalem. And Greek had become so much of a common language in the Eastern Mediterranean that a lot of literature was being translated into Greek because then you could sell that book anywhere. Almost everyone who was literate at that time knew Greek. And so Ptolemaios commissioned a translation of the Old Testament for Greek speakers. And what do you know? It was a panel of 70 translators, Septuaginta. And these were hand-picked experts on Hebrew and Greek. Now, when we're talking about the Septuagint, we run into a problem immediately. There's some disagreement about exactly how many translators there actually were, and that's a problem. When you refer to the book by the number of translators, it's kind of important to get that right, but it looks like they didn't. To ensure that the interpretation was accurate and fair across the board for all Jews, Ptolemaios appointed 6 translators from each tribe of Israel. Now, there were 12 tribes of Israel, theoretically, and 6 times 12 was 72, even back then. Okay, so in the next volume on this subject, we'll talk about the actual Exodus and the plagues of Egypt, and Moses hightailing it out of Egypt with Aaron and this mob of people, mostly ex-slaves and non-Egyptians, who wanted to go back to the legendary home of their ancestors, Canaan, the Promised Land. But that's a long walk, and they definitely faced some hard times out there in the wilderness, and we'll talk about that. We'll also get to the harem conspiracy, all the hot tea on how little Ramses died, and the trial that was all the rage in Egypt. It was kind of like the trial of the millennium. Eat your heart out, OJ. These murderers were much more famous back then. And as we'll see, while Moses was trying to guide his flock back to Canaan, the fallen Lil Ramses was succeeded by one of his sons who was not implicated in the murder plot. One of his sons apparently was plotting against his father to take over the throne, as you do. But there was one son who was the good son, apparently. Or maybe he was so smart that he pulled off the assassination of his father and then framed his brother. We may never know. But this new guy who takes over, in keeping with the nomenclature that I have established, we'll have to call him Micro Ramses. And poor Micro Ramses had the misfortune of ruling Egypt during its final breaths as a world power. Its Bronze Age glory was over forever. And at the same time, the Israelites get home. And a few generations later, they were a military force to be reckoned with. And they started taking over Canaan. Joshua was one of the first war leaders that would grow out of Israel. But that's a little later. So anyway, in the next volume on the Bronze Age collapse, we'll cover that. But next week will not be more Bronze Age stuff. I gotta give people a break. And we have a little while to get deeper into this, especially looking at the Greco-Roman side of things, which will come just in time for the arrival of Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. But next week will be another subject. It's a surprise. I'm gonna do something very different, or go back to something that I never completed in the past. That never happens. I normally finish everything I start. But anyway, until then, talk to you later.